If you want to understand politics, you have to follow the money. In fact, that's how we explain our work here at OpenSecrets. Today, we're going to learn more about how Minnesota keeps track of the money influencing elections. I am David Myers, and this is the State of Disclosure. Today, I am speaking with Jeff Sigurdson, Executive Director of the Minnesota Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board. Jeff, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, David. Appreciate the opportunity to have a conversation.
Great. Well, let's jump right into it then. Let's start big picture. Tell us what it is you do and why it's important.
Well, the Campaign Finance Board and Public Disclosure Board, I should emphasize, is responsible for collecting the campaign finance information for state level candidates, not local level, but state level candidates. We also administer the lobbying program and the economic interest statement program. Again, all three programs are hoped that they work together in providing disclosure to the public so that they have confidence that the decisions are being made for them by elected officials and other public officials are in the public's best interest. And that's really kind of the goal for all three programs, is to highlight that sort of disclosure so that the public can understand the forces that are being brought to bear here in terms of who's spending money, who's trying to contact their public officials, and how that all plays together.
Can you dive in a little deeper on the differences between those three programs?
Sure. Again, the campaign finance is looking at the state level candidates. We have disclosure, of course, on their contributions and expenditures. Minnesota also has a public subsidy program, which is basically a program in which the candidates agree to a spending limit, and in exchange, they have access to the political contribution refund program, which is a program which allows contributors to be refunded by the state up to $75 of a contribution to a candidate who participates. And then also a candidate in the public subsidy program, if they win the primary election, will receive a payment from the state, typically about 20% of the spending limit, sometimes a little less than that, depending on the office. But at any rate, a significant amount of the spending limit, which will again help them with their campaign. And that information, of course, is brought forward. But we also have the political committees, funds, and party units for the state, especially with the rise and importance of independent expenditures, providing disclosure on those entities so that everyone understands where they're receiving their funding to the extent that that's possible. Making sure that that's available to the public as well, so that they can, again, track the entities that are contacting them. You know, who's this mailer from? Oh, well, it's this association. I can at least go see the officers for that association in their last report. And then for the lobbying program, if you are lobbying either political subdivisions, the legislature, or what we call administrative lobbying, which is where you're trying to affect administrative rules for a state agency, all of that has to be, those individuals have to register with the board. They report their total expenditures, and they also report the specific subjects that they were working on in each of those areas. So again, we feel that's an important part of understanding well, the whole process, you know, from elected official to, okay, I was elected, here's the pressure I now face. And just to make sure that the public, again, is confident, we have the economic interest statement where a public official provides information on their financial holdings, just so that if there's a question about whether or not there's a conflict of interest, there's at least this record where they state, here's what, the securities that I own, other than my personal property, what other property do I own or I should say, other than my homesteaded property, my personal residence, what other property may I own within the state? What does my spouse, own, and their employment, so we can again see if there's any potential conflicts, or at least that's disclosed to the extent possible.
It sounds like a lot. You must be doing a ton of work educating candidates, the public, and others about how all this works. How much of your time is spent on that side versus the actual work of enforcing transparency?
Well, they certainly fall together. And really, I guess I will step back and say that in my almost 30 years in this position, I'm still fairly optimistic about the motives of the average candidate and treasurer. Every once in a while, you may run into someone who truly isn't too concerned about rules, but most volunteer treasurers and candidates aren't trying to get in trouble. I mean, they are trying to follow the statute. They're trying to stay within the lines. And so all the work that we do there, we think is extremely important. We do find that because of limited staff versus um, an ever-growing number of candidates and lobbyists and public officials, that we're increasingly finding that doing our training through video recordings that can be accessed 24/7 by the regulated community is really extremely important. And although we still offer in-person training, um, I do think that from our feedback and from the conversations we've had with the regulated community, I think it's pretty clear that providing that sort of 24/7 access to answers is really something that you have to do if you want your training to be really effective, because people find it hard to break out 2 hours of time to attend a training session.
Or,
Um,
oh, sorry, keep going.
no, I'm fine. Go ahead.
You mentioned that you've been in this job almost 30 years. I'm curious, what drew you to the role and why do you keep doing the same thing? What keeps you there?
Well, I'll even step back further than that. I'm getting real close to 40 years in state service. The first 10 years was with the Secretary of State's office in administering elections. Then opportunity came over to be on this side, which is, again, of course, obviously the campaign finance side, or regulation of money. But really, I'm one of those, I suppose, I don't know if it's rare or not, but sometimes I think it's rare. A person who actually went to school to get a degree in this, but my degree is a master's of public administration, political science as the undergrad. And so this has always been an area of interest. And I'm very fortunate in that I was able to match up, um, you know, my personal interest. I guess I'm an election geek. That's a term you sometimes heard. Um, and I, and I enjoy it. I still find it's interesting. I still find the community of people who are involved in politics to be very interesting to deal with. And so it hasn't been a chore. And I continue to to find interest every year. The legislature is looking at issues and trying to solve problems. So.
So, thinking about the legislature, I was reading a little bit about the political contribution refund program in advance of this call, and I saw that there was recently a bipartisan bill passed to shore up the program. Uh, is there a history of bipartisan support for campaign finance laws in Minnesota?
I think so. Certainly, the public subsidy program is used by about 94% of the candidates that file for office, or is agreed to by 94% of the candidates, roughly. Um, and that, so obviously, that's bipartisan. And I know that there is some differences, obviously, in the legislature about disclosure, and some of that there are differences, but the general idea that there's a role here to keep the money, let me step back and look at it this way. The public subsidy program, in a lot of ways, allows a non-incumbent to run effectively for office, or at least to get their foot in the door. The PCR program makes it easier to raise initial contributions from small donors. The public subsidy program certainly doesn't pay for anyone's entire campaign, but it helps. And I think there's a recognition for most legislators who realize that one of the reasons they got elected in the first place was participating in the program. It simply made it easier for them to run for office for the first time. And so from that basis, I think there is a reason. That's one of the main reasons why there's continued bipartisan support for the program.
Why do you think that program or that collection of programs isn't replicated more often across other states?
Well, I guess I'm seeing an effort by at least cities to come up with some variation. Now, I recognize that there you talk about democracy dollars and Seattle and programs like that are trying to um, I guess take a different path, but it's in many ways it's the same idea. It's providing some sort of counterbalance here with public funding to encourage people to get involved. Whether that's going to be directly providing a coupon, or in this case, we take the middle step where you have to get a refund for money that you put up front. Regardless, it's really an effort to try to get small donors more involved, And I do think I'm starting to see that, at least when I attend conferences, that there's a growing realization that there's some role here to try to balance off the very large contributors or sources of funding for elections with encouraging smaller donations. So hopefully that will continue.
And are there lessons that you're picking up from officials you talk to at those conferences from other states or cities, things that you are trying to implement in your office?
Well, I mean, I think you always learn things that you didn't know when you go to those conferences. Sometimes it's you're hearing about court actions that you weren't aware of that you have to at least be following on some level. And of course, there is differences between the states.
Mhm.
But we try to incorporate the best practices that whenever they become something that we can try to integrate into our office.
Right. So now, we're into primary season for congressional races. Anything top of mind, anything worrying you, anything you're focused on as Minnesota gears up?
Well, I don't know that it's on the campaign finance side that they're really I'm seeing too much that's different this year. I do think that there's a lot of concern on the election administration side about what new federal requirements there may be. But frankly, this agency that's an issue that the Secretary of State is dealing with. This agency probably is not affected by that very much. Um, no, this hopefully it's going to be a very busy year for us because everyone's on the ballot. Our constitutional officers, governor in both the Senate and the House, every member is up for election. So it'll be a test, but I don't think there are any new issues for us this year.
All right, that's good. So I want to get into the wish list part of our conversation now. A couple hypotheticals for you. If is there one thing you wish the people of your state knew more about or cared more about in relation to campaign finance, like something that people don't realize that you're doing or how the state does things differently?
Well, we've already kind of touched on it. The political contribution refund program, I think, is not as widely publicized as it probably should be. It's a little surprising to me that the political parties, for example, I didn't mention this before, but it's not only candidates. Political parties can also issue political contribution refunds. And I would think that that would be something they want to trumpet from the top of the tower. But for whatever reason, that doesn't seem to be the case. And I think there's room with the existing program to expand that out and get a lot more participation. So I wish that was the case. We are trying to, I will say, I guess part of my wish list we're hopefully working on our disclosure that we're getting now, have been getting for years and years, is very specific to a candidate. In other words, we get a report, but if you want to compare candidates across districts or even multiple candidates within a district, you have to accumulate that information more or less by yourself. And that, I think, is asking for a lot. So what we're trying to do, we've rolled out our first application and are working on at least one more, hopefully by the end of this year. It's a mapping application that allows you to see expenditures and campaign expenditures and independent expenditures on different maps by legislative districts. So you can see the districts where the most expenditures are occurring, where independent expenditures are occurring. You can drill down and see the entities that are making those independent expenditures and compare the amounts by candidate. I think that sort of aggregating the information and presenting it in a graphic format hopefully will make it more approachable. I do think that the public is interested in our subjects or the disclosure that we can offer them, but they may not be willing to take the time to go through, you might understand, hundreds of reports. So if we can find a way to present that to them graphically, I'm hopeful that that will increase their interest in the information that we do have.
Are there limits on out-of-state campaign or committee contributions or independent expenditures?
Independent expenditures, no, there's no limit on that. They have to be made through an independent expenditure committee or fund, and so we have disclosure of the money coming in. But in terms of limits on how much they spend or how much they raise, no, there is none. Political parties in the state do not have contribution limits either, and political parties can make independent expenditures. So that is also another conduit for that. Contributions to candidates are, of course, limited, and they can't be from corporations.
Mhm.
If they're from an association, a committee that's not registered with the state, then they have to get a report of underlying disclosure. So, and again, they're limited in how much they can take from that entity.
And are the reimbursements limited to residents of the state only?
That's correct. I should have said that. Yep, they're only eligible to Minnesota residents.
Got it. Uh, if you had a magic wand and you could change a law or a regulation or create something new about how disclosure is handled or transparency issues are handled in your state, what would you want to change?
Um, I think it does come back to the question of how far do you go down, the layers of the onion, I guess is the way you hear it all the time,
Mhm.
on understanding the true source of funding for independent expenditures. I do think I said sometimes that there's a difference in the parties and the way that they view that disclosure, and that's kind of true, but not in their perception that there's a problem. Both sides, at least in my experience in committee, are willing to admit that there is a problem here, but the approach is somewhat different. And how do we deal with this? What can we do before we're finding ourselves in court, frankly. So that's the issue that I wish I had some magic potion for it to, because I do think in the end we're starting to see people discouraged and disillusioned by the process because there isn't enough disclosure on the ultimate source of funding. If that was understood, the public still may not be happy about the amount, but at least they would understand, okay, these are the voices that are actually talking to us. And I think that would help, the perception of elections would be when enhanced if that occurred.
Do you have any role in advocating for that kind of change?
The board on occasion, personally, no, because I represent a board of six appointed members. The board has, on occasion, advocated for uh, various things that, I think come under the heading of a fairly progressive. For example, we have not always had electioneering communication disclosure. That was something the board was interested in, tried for several years to get it through, and eventually it did occur. But at any rate, that sort of the board does become active in those areas, but not on a regular basis. And frankly, not if it doesn't have a clear answer. Like I said, I wish I knew what the magic potion is. I'm not sure that I've heard the magic solution to this problem. So I'm not sure what the board would be advocating for. But there is a role for the board. I think the board has enough respect in the legislature that it provides information to show this is at least defining the problem for you. This is here's the amount of money coming into the state, and this is the limited knowledge that we have about it. So we at least have a clear picture of what the issue is, and then it's probably up to the legislature to decide how we resolve that.
Sure. So finally, my last question is asking you to look into the future. How do you see campaign finance systems in your state evolving? This could be a combination of the things you want to see happen and what you think will actually happen. But what does the future hold?
Well, I think one thing that will eventually happen is there's a growing realization, I think, that local elections are becoming more contested and frankly are an area where more and more money is being spent. The regulation of local elections is fairly limited. Sure, there's a reporting requirement, but it's a very simple report. And they're filed locally, so there's kind of an inconsistent level of disclosure that's being provided. I do think that is something that's going to be looked at. I think there's an awareness that in some cities, at least, in school districts and counties, that's sort of the minor leagues towards the state legislature. Most members of the legislature are not elected without first holding office in one of those levels of local government. And so that's becoming an area where you're seeing more money being spent. And I think that there's more interest in understanding that. Um, I do think too that you're going to see more of a push towards somehow moving, and I don't know exactly how this will occur, but moving the contribution program into a way in which people don't have to wait for their refund.
Mhm.
That's the the I guess technical problem that we have with it is that the time between when you make the contribution and when you get the refund is at least weeks and maybe months. And for some people, that's not insignificant. I mean, and frankly, perhaps that would be even the reason why they don't make a contribution is that they simply can't have, $75 out of their pocket for that long a period of time. So I think there is interest in the legislature in either shortening the time dramatically by making, some sort of application so it can be done almost immediately online, or maybe going to more of a coupon process where the contributor doesn't put anything up front. I don't know which path will be taken, but I do think there's a realization that it would be a more effective program if the time frame was reduced between when the contribution is made and when the refund is received.
Well, Jeff, this has been great. I really appreciate you taking the time. It's been fascinating to learn how your office works and what's going on in Minnesota. So thank you for that. Uh, to our audience, if you'd like to learn more about how money works in politics and how to follow the money yourself, visit us at opensecrets.org. Jeff, thanks again.
Thank you, David.